Our guest tonight needs very little in the way of introduction. He is, as I'm sure you're all aware, a long-time political and environmental activist. He's a former senator for Tasmania. He's a former leader of the Australian Greens. He's the author of a great number of books, including most recently this one, Optimism, Reflections on a Life of Action, about which we'll be talking tonight. Can I ask you to join me in making welcome to the Melbourne Writers' Festival, Bob Brown. Thank you very much. Well, Bob, to begin with, the book Optimism, which I must say is one of the best political titles for this time we could possibly imagine, it's not quite an autobiography, but as the subtitle Reflections of a Life of Action suggests, it does have considerable amount of autobiographical material. So I thought we might begin by talking about a time that you cover in some detail in the book, in the early 1970s, when you're first finding your feet in the environmental movement and with your politics. If we go back to the Bob Brown of 1974, how would he compare to the Bob Brown we know in 2014?
You know, a couple of things have changed. One is that in 1974, actually 1976, I came out about my sexuality. In 1974, I took a Greyhound bus trip around the United States, and I had a friend who was I was a young doctor, and I had a friend who was studying nuclear medicine at the University of Chicago, Tony Booth. And so I was going to end up seeing him, and I had some adventures along the way in New Orleans, where I had an anaphylactic reaction to ants that bit me in the park, and I thought I was going to die. And I can still remember the person in the drug shop, as it was called, putting the change, and I'd asked for some antihistamines on my chest as I lay on my back in the shop with people going around and thought I'm going to die. But I survived that, and I visited Memphis because that's where Elvis hanged out, and went to Chicago and was at the university there for a couple of weeks. And in winter, so it must have been late in the year, snow all over the compound. Here was a little group of people in the middle who had a table and a cover of some sort, and were stopping when I asked to say, well, will you come and join? We're having a protest outside a hotel in town tonight because the Greek generals have just driven their tanks into Athens University, killing 19 students. And Henry Kissinger, the Secretary of State, supports that, and we oppose it, so would you come along? Now, so I did, and in fact, this is the first protest that I ever attended, and we walked around in a circle in the snow, and I had my picture taken more times than I've ever had it taken before. And I still think they're at the CIA trying to work out who this person is in this picture, with placards up as Henry Kissinger gave his talk. So it was, I had the feeling that something had to be done about the things that were wrong in the world, but I didn't know what. I was introverted and had a long way to go. And then 2 years later, consequent on travelling down the Franklin River with Paul Smith, the forester, he talked me into, because I told him I was gay, and he talked me into going public with that. And it's a curious thing. It was a mistake at the time because it wasn't a springboard to a political career in those days. And I was chided by quite a few people in the consequent years for having revealed my sexuality. But it was the genie out of the bottle, and it's made so much of a difference. And of course, how can you be confident if you can't talk about your sexuality? I mean, it's crushing not to be able to. And so in the long run, that coming out when I was 24 or 6 or whatever it was, has been a gift to my life, and it gets better as time goes along. Other than that, I don't think the world's changed too much. I know that we're in depressing times, but people have been in worse times than we see on the planet now, and some things have changed radically for the better in those years. So, 40 years? So I'm feeling happier than ever before in my life, and that's because I couldn't dream then that I would be getting close to celebrating 20 years with my companion Paul, who is a wellspring of optimism for me, and how good life can be if you can not only have a good career open to you, but seize what opportunities that come along and find a person with whom to share it. It just makes life so much better. I couldn't have dreamt that was going to happen to me back then, so I'm glad I hung on.
Well, let's touch on that, because for me, one of the most poignant parts of the book was when you talk about having electroshock aversion therapy to change your sexuality. And then you say afterwards, quite a remarkable statement, that you feel no ill will to the doctors who performed what we would generally think now is a very barbarous procedure. Do you want to explain that?
Yes, well, people do pay a lot of money for fairly barbarous procedures, which seem to be contrary to their own natural makeup these days. I can think of a few. But back then, it wasn't, I was entrapped by a heterosexual society which imprisoned people and had not long before hung people, men, for homosexuality. And my dad was a policeman, so was his dad, so were four of my uncles, so were two of my cousins, so were all my siblings. I had varicose veins, so I didn't. It was an incredible imprisonment to put on oneself. Witness the two young men hung by the Ayatollahs in Iran in January this year because they loved each other. So being able to try to get out of that by any mechanism was warranted. And I was a medical student and read about aversion therapy. I tried testosterone and it didn't work, and so I went for the shock therapy. And because I wanted to be able to be out there in society and function as a normal human being. And these doctors were experimenting with cure for homosexuality. So for the first time, I was speaking with other men who knew I was gay and weren't judgmental about it. They didn't say very much at all, really, They were busy getting ready to give me an electric shock next time a picture of a naked man came up in front, and a glass of water if it was a naked lady. But it didn't work, and it doesn't work because our sexuality is part of our makeup, just the same as the right thigh bone, or the shape of our or the colour of our left eye, and now it sounds barbarous, but then it sounded like something was trying to be done. See, the feeling in society everywhere was that homosexuality was a criminal trait. Not just for those who had this sexuality, but the whole of society. And my whole childhood was spent with language and jokes about homosexuality, I see such things as blackballing, which is applying boot polish to the scrotum of cadets now being uncovered at the Royal Military College Duntroon. Everybody thought that was fair go at cadet camps and so on. The whole of society knew about that. And it isn't just something that was covert at the time. We have changed as a society for the better. And we must, as with so many other civilising things that have happened in us getting to be here with a free and open discussion like this tonight in Australia in 2014, something impossible, 100 or 200 years ago. But it's part of that process. And when I'm 70 this year, Jeff, and I've just seen some wonderful things happen in that time, not just for myself, but to society as a whole. Seen some terrible, some bloody and some awful things happen and continuing to happen. But it doesn't do just to concentrate on those. We must think about them and try to change them, but we must also celebrate the things that have gone right. And we're just about to see, I think, perhaps under the Abbott government, extraordinarily enough, a free vote which will lead to equal marriage in Australia, with 70% of Australians now supporting it. What a great thing.
Yeah. Well, it goes to the title of the book, doesn't it? I mean, there are changes for the better, and we are never going back to how these things once were. But let me touch on that. I mean, it seems to me that really the heart of the book, and you can feel it in your writing, that it's the heart of your politics, is the Franklin Dam campaign in this book. What made that campaign so successful, and what can activists today learn from it?
Well, a dinkum relationship to the land, which gives us everything we have, and which we must be worried we're being cut off from. There was those of us who were centrally involved in that campaign had lived by the river, floated down it, seen the eagles soaring, the canyons, the waterfalls, the ancient yew and pine trees, the leatherwood blossoms floating down on the amongst the arabesques of the white foam on the river in its stiller places, and knew that this was all going to be destroyed by inundation like the sensationally beautiful Lake Pedder, which had been destroyed just a few years earlier. And both those things were galvanising, and they came together and said, either we make a stand here, or nobody else will be able to come back and undo it. And so we did. And the thing that happened was, and Paul Smith, the forester who asked me to go down the river in the first place, was initially responsible. Next year he said, we'll go down and take a movie camera. So I bought a second-hand Bolex 16mm wind-up camera, which we took down the river and made a film, which we got to put on Tasmanian television commercially Saturday night with Tats Lotto in the middle break for $800. What a bargain that was. And suddenly everybody in Tasmania knew about the Franklin, and ditto as it spread through the mainland. And it was the people of Australia who saved the Franklin through modern technology enabling it to be seen in their living rooms, and options given for people to take action about it.
Let's talk about your political career. I was struck by the parallels between your entry into Parliament in Tasmania and your entry into the Senate. Now, if I've got this right, in 1983, you spent 19 days in prison in Hobart for protesting the Franklin. On the day of your release, you became a member of Tasmania's Parliament.
It was actually the day after.
In 1995, you were locked up for 11 days and strip searched 5 times for joining a blockade of bulldozers invading the Tarkine wilderness. The next year, you were elected to the Senate. Now, we see with the current crop of senators, there seems to be a pretty steep learning curve when people go into parliamentary politics. But coming straight from prison into Parliament, was that a particularly steep learning curve? And how did you cope with
I think it was an enormously appropriate preparation. And at the end of that first year, it was a very hostile Parliament, because everybody else in there, except for, I think, the greatest 20th century Premier of Tasmania, Doug Lowe, who'd been axed over wanting to save the Franklin, and Norm Sanders, the Democrat member. But everybody else was hostile, and the leader of the future Premier, Field, said to me at Christmas dinner that year in Parliament, I went along and was feeling very isolated, and I lined up for the turkey, and when he was in the queue behind me, and I turned around to say hello to him, and he said, well, this is after the Franklin was saved, well, Bob, you've got nowhere to go now but down. And I hadn't forgotten that. Well, he became Premier and got the Order of Australia. I didn't become Minister for anything, but I'm very, very happy that in a political career, while we were adding a green component to an increasingly similar, not bipartisan but unipartisan Liberal-Labor governance in Tasmania and then in Australia, that to have represented Tasmania and Australians, democracy is the best we've got, It's a very privileged place to be. You can learn fast, and you can do so much in there, even outside the fact that the government's got the reins. And for example, bringing in legislation for freedom of information in Tasmania, the strongest legislation ever, that finally got through. Legislation for right to have the machines turned off if you're dying, instead of being kept artificially alive. Legislation for euthanasia, which hasn't yet got through, even though 80% of Australians support it, and a very virulent minority oppose it. And of course, the classic mistake in 1978, I think, of legislating on the run and effectively banning lesbian behaviour in Tasmania. I became, overnight, I made a mistake in an amendment to legislation to the Crimes Act, which effectively ended up banning lesbianism in Tasmania. And can I just
Yeah, of course,
it's
it's a good story.
I don't know if any of you have ever internally hemorrhaged and imploded and felt you just wanted to get off the planet, but that was me when I went home and realised what I'd done. And I moved this amendment, which I had tried to move to get rid of the criminalisation of male homosexuality. Nobody supported that. So I tried to make the clause gender neutral, and they immediately all supported it with no debate. And so suddenly female homosexuality was a criminal offence the same as male sexuality. And that applied nowhere else in the British Empire or Commonwealth of Nations. Apocryphally, because Queen Victoria hadn't believed such a thing could happen. Whether this is true or not, I don't know, but female homosexuality wasn't included. Well, the Examiner ran the headline, lesbian ban looms. Dr. Bob Brown moved this, and I was, and the Attorney General of the day, the Liberal Attorney General, Labor had supported it as well, said no, we're not going to change it in the upper house. So I rang the most Liberal person in the upper house in Tasmania and appealed to him to please change this terrible mistake I'd made banning lesbianism. And he said, oh no, it sounds like a good idea to me, Bob, I'm not going to... So, world's top sexuality wowser was to be my political epithet. But Christine Milne and I discuss this quite often. In the greatest of adversity, something drops from the sky, if only you keep going. And the something on this occasion was the Premier of Queensland, Joe Jelke-Petersen, who was asked, because this was rapidly becoming a national sensation, my legislative breakthrough, and he was asked whether he too was going to ban lesbians in Queensland. And he said, oh goodness, no. He was very keen on jailing male homosexuals, but he wasn't going to interfere with the law as far as females were concerned. So I knew that there was no point in me lobbying the very conservative Legislative Council, so I wrote them a note anonymously, attached this comment from Joe Jelke-Petersen, who was a fellow thinker of theirs,
so to speak.
and the Examiner article, which quoted Victoria as Queen Victoria, because over the Legislative Council in Tasmania, if you ever go to Tasmania, it's in Salamanca Place, go up the stairs, it's the right-hand end of Parliament, and you'll see a massive portrait of Queen Victoria the Younger, 1834, in a gilt human pine frame, and she leans out over the chamber, looking like she might, if she fell, compact a few skulls with... so it's a reminder of where they're at. And they had to choose, on the note, I effectively pointed out they had a choice between what Queen Victoria and Joe Jelke-Petersen thought or that homosexual in the lower house, Dr. Bob Brown. So they rescinded the amendment and I was saved, and so were the lesbians of Tasmania.
Well, fortunately, you're not going to be remembered for that, but one moment I think you probably are going to be remembered for is that iconic image of Australian parliamentary politics is the time when you and Kerry Nettle heckled George Bush around, interjected in reference to David Hicks and Mamdouh Habib when Bush was addressing a joint sitting of the two houses of Parliament. What was that experience like? I mean, in the book, you seem to be suggesting that the other parliamentarians were more hostile to it than Bush himself.
Well, that's true, and it was terrifying. I'd just the day before said to Kerry Nettle, the young New South Wales Greens it was then, there was just the two of us in the Parliament. Iraq was in turmoil with the invasion, and George W. Bush was in town to address the Parliament of the Deputy Sheriff in Prime Minister John Howard. And, you know, I see so little in terms of comment by either of those gentlemen on the horror that Iraq is now, 11 years later. That aside, when the time came, I got to my feet. I didn't heckle, I just said very loudly, President Bush, he was onto Iraq, and what a great friend John Howard, who he had described as fair dinkum, which he explained to us Australians who didn't know, meant John Howard was fair dinkum, and George Bush explained to us in the Parliament that it meant a man of steel. Did you know that? Anyway, I said to him that if you obey the laws of the world will respect you, because he was breaching international law by the invasion of Iraq, as well as the two Australians being kept in Guantanamo Bay, while he transferred the two Americans who had been in Guantanamo Bay to American court jurisdiction. John Howard says now that he had tipped George Bush off that I was going to intervene. And I tend to think that could be true. He'd met Bush in, I think, Bangkok a couple of weeks earlier. And so Bush came back very quickly with, he was stopped by this and came back very quickly with, I believe in free speech. And so I said, so do I. But he didn't believe in it all that much because he never again addressed a parliament anywhere in the world. He was asked to Ottawa and to London, but he didn't want to be exposed to a parliamentarian speaking up in their own parliament to the president of a visiting country, which was where it was at. It was a terrifying, my heart started to pound before I got up to speak, but I did, and the Speaker of the House ordered us out, and we didn't because he had no power over senators. They've never had a joint sitting of Parliament in Australia again. We were illegally blocked from going into the joint sitting the next day for the visiting Chinese Premier. Overnight, the Chinese government had said to the speakers of the Australian Parliament, if Brown is in there tomorrow, the President won't appear. And they said, well, we will block him from coming into the Parliament. Now, there was no time to get to the High Court or get a constitutional ruling on this, but as an elected representative of the Australian people, and with Kerry Nettle, they've managed to stop any reform, and the reform I advocated was simply having the Australian Journalist Code of Ethics drawn up entirely by the Australian journalists, codified. Engineers have laws about their professionalism, doctors do. Then why not journalists? But anyway, howled down and happened to get one or two cartoons in newspapers with a Gestapo hat on, burning books. It isn't mature commentary, and I think the editor of The Australian ought to grow up and understand that he's just an equal individual with everybody else in this country, man, woman and child, and that he has no special bead on how the country should be run, and he is letting down his side in not covering the news and confining his comments to his editorial columns. But that's not the way it is. But if I have a bit of advice to the gentleman, it is bring back the news and stop opinionating yourself and thinking you can make and break governments. Maybe that's part of the reason why your circulation's falling and the paper's not doing so well. It's vindictive, it's vendetta-oriented, and it's destructive of democracy. But, you know, that's what we've got. Thank goodness we're getting a much more diverse media these days through the wonders of cyberspace.
We are starting to get a bit short on time, but I do want to ask you about another figure who you write about in the book with, I guess, considerable respect, and that's Julia Gillard. Now, we were talking before about iconic parliamentary moments. I guess the iconic Gillard moment is the misogyny speech. How important do you think sexism was in the downfall of Julia Gillard?
I was there all the way through, and I spoke up about the sexism being aimed at her, not least in through the pages of the paper I've just spoken about. During the 2010 election campaign, she'd just been made Prime Minister, and you might remember had replaced Kevin Rudd, and as I say in the book, she hadn't necessarily had a good opinion of myself. But the election came around, and she was first cab off the rank, and I met her the next day here in Melbourne to discuss how Adam Bant had just been elected in the seat of Melbourne, the first time that had happened for any third party at a national election in Australia since just after the Second World War. So the Greens were going very, very strongly and would help arbitrate who became government. And I was quite determined to speak to both the Liberals and to Labor, but there was a silence from Tony Abbott's side, and I, in fact, got to meet him 10 days later. Julia Gillard was very businesslike. She wanted me immediately to give assurance that we wouldn't block supply and that we wouldn't support no confidence motions, i.e. that the government could function. And I told her that I was, interested in this. I had to work it out with my party room. And a week or two later, as I say in the book, we had a list of innovative green ideas, social justice, as well as environmental ideas and reform of democracy, which she had agreed to, and she kept her word. There were a couple of things that didn't come about, and understanding democracy, that's the way it was. I knew that you had to put up the list of things you were expecting to get in return for granting government at the outset. Leave it to the second year or the third year and nothing will happen. But she was good to her word, and it was very tough for her. She had made that famous statement, there'll be no carbon tax or legislation on greenhouse gases in the next period of government, same as Tony Abbott. But government was important to her, and yes, she copped it. And you know, the Tony Abbott standing in front of Bob Brown's bitch signs outside Canberra is an extreme moment of it, but typifies the view that they were going to bring that government down. I think it would have been regardless. I don't think sexism was the biggest thing that was aimed at Julia Gillard, or even one of the most important things, but it was there and it was ramped up. And her speech it fortunately led to her speech on misogyny, which is a hallmark of her prime ministership, and it'll be read by people down the ages. So the reaction to that misogyny is a sterling part of Australian political history for the future.
I have about 100 more questions, but I don't think we're going to get through them. But just very quickly, Tony Abbott, once seen as an unelectable extremist, is now our Prime Minister. Australia effectively doesn't have a climate change policy anymore. Does that mean that Australians have lost interest in the environment?
Well, he was an unelectable extremist, but now we know he's electable. And no, we don't. However, I just want to point to this, that 90% of Australians in September last year voted for 6 mega coal ports inside the Great Barrier Reef, exporting the Galilee Basin coal, including Clive Palmer's and Gina Rinehart's and Mr Adani's, to the rest of the world to triple our per capita output of greenhouse gases. And all voters except those who voted Green voted that way. Did Australians want that outcome? No, they don't. But here's the difference. Are we going to get it right until we understand that we should vote in the interests of our children, our grandchildren, our great-grandchildren? And until we're able to walk up the path to the ballot box and vote for the person who's going to give our great-grandchildren the greatest legacy, we are going to get it wrong on this little planet, which is going into downward spiral as far as its life-giving biosphere is concerned, and we all know that. But if we're going to be caught voting on passing tax matters, passing who's going to give us the best largesse, the more money in our pocket, in the wealthiest society ever to exist on the face of the planet, then our great-grandchildren are going to live to regret it. And I just have to paraphrase Drew Dellinger, the American poet in there, who says, it's 3:23 in the morning, I can't sleep, because my great-great-grandchildren won't let me. They come to me in dreams and they say, what did you do when the seasons were changing? What did you do when the mammals and reptiles and birds were going to extinction? Did you go onto the streets in protest when democracy was stolen? What did you do? Well, that's what we should be thinking when we walk to the next ballot box.
Just finally, before we throw to questions, we began by asking you to look back to 40 years in the past, 1974. If we're going to look forward to Australia 40 years in the future, what do you expect to see?
Well, I love Australians, and I think we've collectively got an enormously strong humanity about us, which is being bought and sold at the moment, but we are being tested very, very strongly. I like to think that the current government is a glitch. And if we are determined to have that humanity, then it will lead us to be, because we're so wealthy, it will lead us to be a world leader in bringing together a planetary move to recognise that everybody on this planet's equal, our destiny is equal, and this country, with its fabulous advantages, is able to share with a magnanimity what's going on in the rest of the world beyond other countries. In other words, we'll set a lead. I don't know how much money our government has so far put into the Ebola, the spectre of Ebola in Africa, but I do know, sadly, that in the last week of the last election campaign, Tony Abbott promised to take $4 billion, I think it's ended up $7 billion out of the forward estimates for overseas aid to build more roads in Australia, and it won a lot of votes. And Tim Costello from this great city came out and said that'll cost 400 to 500,000 infant lives. Well, it helped the vote. And until we can think about that 50 years down the line and our responsibility to those of us who are less well off on the planet, and I believe that, well, when I talk to people, I know that comes out very quickly. And we're not addled and sidetracked by the immediacy of the way the Murdoch media, for example, works. We're underselling ourselves. That's the thing. we are selling ourselves short as Australians. We're a lot better than that. And 40 to 50 years from now, I think we can lead the world and will lead the world if the lot better than that expresses itself. It's just up to us.
We have about 15 minutes now for questions from the floor. I do think we have a roving microphone, unless that's the one that we've got here. So, if there are any questions, if you can put your hand up, I'll call you as I see it and I'll get a microphone to you. There's a person down the front here, and I think there's someone coming down the aisle with a microphone. Is there? No?
I may as well jump in. You have a chapter in your wonderful book, Bob, called The New Religion, about the religion of economic growth. I was hoping you could say a few words about that, please.
Yes, and I had a little bit of a contretemps with the wonderful Alison Hugh, who's the editor of the book. She's a dairy farmer out at Warrnambool. And I insisted that materialism be capitalised because it is a religion. And until we understand it, and it's side-swiping all the previous religions, and it has the world by the throat. And at the centre of that religion is the great God growth, capital G again. And you must ascribe to growth or you will be penalised with recessions, mass unemployment, civil insurrection. It's very, very compelling. There is, fortunately, a prodigious search on at the moment for alternative economic models and people talking about it. And I know there's somebody in this audience tonight who's at the forefront of that. But at the moment, extract what you can, make yourself wealthy now. The golden rule is out. So is the parable of the Good Samaritan. And everything is to do with get what you can now. And unless this is understood as a religion which is self-destructive at the end, because we're on a finite planet and you can't have growth of resources out of that planet. The predictions are up to a 300% increase in use of resources by the end of this century. Well, they don't exist. So we have to use our intelligence to come to an alternative economic model based on ecology, that is understanding the household, informing economy, which is management of the household. And I think we can do that. It doesn't mean we stop. It doesn't mean we go into cave and burn candles, but it does mean that we become much more innovative with what we've got. That this nation doesn't have national recycling laws because both the big parties vote them down every time they're put up is a testimony to the failure of imagination about the reality of a finite planet at the moment. But that again can change. And I think economics is has very exciting prospects for the future. And it will remain central to our deliberations. But until we have a world in which the Minister for the Biosphere and the Minister for Future Generations is up there with the Treasurer in terms of kudos and cabinet, we won't have it quite right.
Well, I must say you're a brave man for picking a fight with an editor about capitalisation. I'll say that as editor myself. We have other questions, I think. A person over here. There's just a microphone coming to you now.
Thank you for the opportunity to ask you a question. My question is not about your book per se, because I haven't read it, unfortunately. My question is regarding the current policy that the government has towards the treatment of asylum seekers, with both parties agreeing to what is popularly known as a Pacific solution. I mean, when it comes to going to the ballot box, whether you vote for Labour or Liberal, at the end of the day, you have asylum seekers fleeing conflict zones in places like Iraq, Afghanistan, many of them minorities, ending up in detention facilities and on small Pacific islands. What, in your opinion, is a way of, I suppose, fighting this policy or countering it for ordinary citizens like myself?
Oh, well, that's a good question. 80% of people voted for the Nauru and Manus Island prescription last year. But the Greens and a number of independents and other small parties were there as an alternative. And if folk didn't vote for that, they didn't think that 2,000 children being locked up and in those appalling circumstances in Nauru and Manus mattered as much as the items which the big parties were offering alternatively. And I think it's appalling, and as you know, the Greens and not least Sarah Hanson-Young with Christine Milne and Adam Bant and the lot have been speaking out about this, but I see the latest polls show that 70% of people support the Manus Island and Nauru solution. Now, whatever else you might say about that, it includes people being processed there in a way that never allows them to get to Australia. We put the burden onto other smaller countries, and Cambodia is now the other solution. We're going to, many years down the line, be as regretful of this as we are nowadays about the White Australia policy or our attitude towards Indigenous Australians. So much worse as it was in the past than it is now. But really we all have the opportunity, the wonders of democracy, and I totally support democratic outcomes, are there, and we make those choices. What does surprise me, and I was talking with an advocate in Melbourne about this today, is that we're so sanguine about it. Where is the 200,000 people on the streets opposing the extraordinary and I think illegal, certainly inhumane, Manus and Nauru? But it's over there, it's out of the way, and we're not thinking about it very much. But each of us can, and besides writing or seeing people about it in politics and supporting groups which are trying to get a better deal for boat people coming to Australia, sending the gift card, specially bought at the newsagent, in handwritten to those people who are standing up to defend them, or indeed to refugee groups to hand on to them, is a really very important thing to do. None of us are stricken with no options here. But it's very important, if you feel strongly about the inhumane way in which Australia is bypassing its responsibility to take care of people coming to our shores, then there's minimum some very strong organisations out there needing financial backing. And who of us can't, if we really get our affairs in order, move towards tithing 10% or 1% of our income to a community action group looking after the interests of something we think is very important.
We have about 5 minutes, so we'll try and get a couple more questions in. Someone over here? I don't think they will be able to. There's a microphone just coming to you now.
I wanted to ask a question about courage and fear and fearlessness. One of the things that I've always admired enormously about you is your courage, and it was really interesting to hear you tonight say that you were really scared asking the heckling George Bush, and that was incredibly inspiring. Because I think we are suffering from profound doses of fear and gutlessness in Australia at the moment. How do you be scared of standing up and do it anyway?
Well, we have to, and Kennedy, of course, said we've got nothing to fear but fear itself. Fear is a fearful condition. I was telling another audience recently about being in a pile of cutting grass in the forests in southern Tasmania when, and I just scooted a couple of young forest protesters right deep into the forest so they'd be safe. We knew these vigilantes were coming, and here was a carload with guns out, all four windows, and a hunting dog in them, and they put the searchlight right onto this pile of cutting grass, and I would have been murdered that night. And so I can tell you I was terror-struck in that pile of cutting grass. They didn't see me. They went back across the bridge. They dynamited and shot holes into the 3 cars that were there and burnt a hole in the forest canopy. And as so often happens, nobody was ever brought to book over this. But I think more fearful than that is to get towards the end of your days and think, what have I done? And so, and involved in doing something is the fear that you're going to make a mistake and be held up to public ridicule. We have to, the Dalai Lama was asked by a 14-year-old in Adelaide 2 years ago. I was there. She said, what's the most important thing a young person can have? And he took her by the hand, looked her in the eye and said, self-confidence. We have a right to the same measure of self-confidence we'd give to everybody else. But the thoughtful and intelligent people tend to think it is somebody else. We make the mistake of, instead of saying everybody's equal, they are better than us, or they're better exponents of what they're doing. And that is to sell oneself short. And we've got to stop doing that. People have got to become much more active on a planet that needs public action. Look, and in Tasmania at the moment, new protest legislation is through the lower house, going into the upper house. If you stand peaceably in front of a chainsaw going to cut down an ancient life-filled forest, $5,000 mandatory sentence, the judge has got no discretion. Do it again, 3 months in jail. We don't have that for abusing children or for robbing a bank. But they're going to have it for people who try to defend what's left of the living biosphere. It's got to be stood up to. And in my case, Eric Abbott can take my pension. The Premier of Tasmania can take my freedom. The upper house leader of this stuff can have my property. I will not be put off standing in defence of those forests when I think it is warranted. I can't do it. I feel the worse if I start thinking, oh, well, that's it. You know, this is all too hard. And I think they're simply building the dam wall higher, and the public is going to come out with a response they don't understand about this. And these things come in surges, but I think they're asking for it on this occasion. So being frightened is part of who we are as human beings. And accepting that you're going to put yourself into a circumstance where you're going to be frightened is a very big breakthrough. It does wonders.
In a session about optimism, that sounds like an optimistic note on which to end. Bob will be in Dimmick's outside signing copies of the book, and you can get a copy there. Feel free to come back into the foyer for the Overland anniversary party, and you can get a copy of the new edition of Overland there. But before you go, please join me in thanking Bob Brown.